understand culturally, particularly as outsiders. Right? And sometimes we disturb because whatever's going on isn't right morally, ethically, and so on. The context, for example, conflict between ethnic minorities in any one neighborhood. Now, what I find interesting is that when we are threatened by change, right, when it all gets a bit complicated, as it were, we get defensive. Yeah? We start retrenching, we become defensive. And there are lots of ways in which that defensiveness finds expression. For example, just a couple of examples. We begin to over-specialize. We use jargon. It's absolutely fantastic how we use complicated words for ordinary things because we professionalize the world and take it over. All right? Does anybody know what a node of interaction is? Any idea? Right? That's real. I mean, I saw it for someone drawing. I asked the guy, what is a node of interaction? It's a bus stop. What is a place of greatest intensity, divergent in its ambition? It's a community center. Right? Hey, you all know that. Jargon is a great defensive mechanism. We oversimplify. That's another great defensive mechanism. We turn complex processes into things. We architects are great at that. Somebody says housing, I go houses. Education, schools. Play, playgrounds. Shopping, shopping malls. That brings it into my world, and I can design it and deliver it. I'm in control again. Right? Processes, after all, are messy. Let's turn it into things. And even the concept of community, we turn into community centers. If I can now design it, I'll give you an example in a minute, how wrong you can be about that. All right, just think about that. Whenever you're threatened, how defensive you're becoming. All right, the second strategic issue to think about when you're talking about making practice strategic is that we often find ourselves dealing with symptoms rather than primary causes of problems. And again, because primary causes are complex to deal with. Somebody says bad housing, fix up the houses. You know, I'll give you a nice renovation plan and improve the stock wonderfully. Right? Then you ask yourself, well, why is the housing bad in the first place? Lack of tenure, lack of security, lack of income, not enough cash, not enough safeguards, subsidize the poorer people, and the rest of it. All right. If I was to look at across the board of housing, water, sanitation, the primary causes that seem to recur, as it were, you wind up with things like lack of ownership, however you define it, dependency thinking behavior. You get people to depend on the government, you or whatever. How do we begin to modify and reduce that? Organizational capacity, misdirected priorities. People come in and say, you know, this is what we're going to do. Everybody agrees, but actually, these guys want to build a school. Our priorities are our employment. Right? That reduces ownership, and therefore people don't care about it. It produces more burdens on the government to come and maintain it, and so the cycle continues. So, organizational capacity, misdirected priorities, poverty, vulnerability are all primary causes. In fact, everyone says, which is why the whole housing program internationally, fairly recently, has been dematerialized in the recognition that in order to get housing right, we've got to deal with issues of poverty and vulnerability. You deal with poverty, there's a whole bunch of things that come up. And then again, you guys are saying, that's not my agenda. I'm an architect. I'm studying to be an architect. Poverty is somebody else's business. It's wrong. How do we redraw the boundaries of our profession so that we can become inclusive of the big issues out there so that we can become relevant? Why is it that after the tsunami, all the architects, at least in the UK, were standing around whilst they're watching the engineers and the water engineers and sanitation engineers and all the rest, rushing around doing all this fantastic stuff, and they were going to saying, can we help? The response was, no, you people design. We'll get back to that later when we're ready. Associating the concept of design with style. And that's not something you do in an emergency situation. Rather than looking at design as a resource, as a way of unlocking resources. Totally different notion. I believe in design. So I'm not a... Right. So, are we prepared as a profession to redraw our boundaries so that we begin to engage the primary causes of some of the issues and take them on board? The third, I need to go a little bit more quickly here. This is all just the first assumption. Don't worry. If you want to fall asleep and so on, I do that all the time. It's late now. If you see me nodding off, it's because I'm very practiced at giving a talk whilst being asleep. Reducing vulnerability, right? It's the third strategic agenda for practice. And as you know, there are all kinds of different kinds of vulnerability: economic, social, environmental. How do we bring some of those agendas on? And some of them are familiar and beginning to be taken on board by the architecture profession. Certainly environmental vulnerability is something that we're beginning to understand in the context and in response to climate change. The fourth strategic agenda for practice is the way in which we manage the constraints out there. You know, there's, I'm trying to do this, but I can't because. How do we begin to deal with that? And someone once told me quite rightly that one of the most creative aspects of any program or any project is the way in which we either dismantle, manage, or mediate the constraints that are out there. I'll come back again to that a bit later, because it can be the most demoralizing activity when you're going around trying to do what you're doing, believing in what you're doing, great aspirations, and every time you come across something, somebody's saying, no, you can't do that. No, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. We don't have enough money. There isn't the technology. There isn't the politics. There isn't the land. And so on. How do we get around that? One of the skills that we've got to be able to engage with is to be devious enough, some people use the word entrepreneurial enough, to find the gap in the constraint to let us through. I can tell you about that as well in a minute. So managing constraints. Certainly there are program constraints that are typical, and they are usually institutional, political, technical, or financial constraints. But importantly, there are constraints that are in place, I'm referring to the Collaborative model here, that prevent ordinary people accessing resources to meet their basic needs. How do we, as planners and designers, right, remove those constraints? And they're mostly there as a result of discrimination, right? Inadvertently, not advertently sometimes. Discrimination by virtue of gender. Women can't own land, right? By virtue of income, you can't get a mortgage unless you've got collateral. I haven't got collateral, sorry, you're out of the system. That's a form of discrimination by virtue of income. By virtue of age, ethnicity, you name it. All those barriers that are there that prevent people accessing essential resources to be engaged in the governance of place and in order to meet their own basic needs. Two sets of constraints. The fifth important part of going strategic, which I would, in a sense, couple all of these into, is there are lots of great little projects all over the place. One of the things that I was accused of in the early days when I was doing what I called community action planning, which before I came around to the idea of strategic action planning, and that is a great little project, but so what? Anyone can design a great project. In the context of the big issues out there, the little projects are nothing. So the question then is, how do we start small change, tiny interventions, small, great little projects that can be scaled up? And here we're talking about not just scaling up in numbers, but scaling up in impacts. You can have a small thing that changes ideas, that changes the technology, that changes our view of thinking. Yeah? As well as, of course, scaling up functionally, organizationally, politically. There's nice, interesting categories that we can talk about in the context of what it means to scale up. And the sixth and final business of becoming strategic, and it may be a surprise to you, that we are extremely bad learners. I am so tired of turning up to projects and places and people talking to me about the same thing that we did 35, 40 years ago coming around again. More recently I was in Prague, we were talking about some housing rights for a particular sector of the population, they were the Roma, and there was this whole discussion about the importance of participation when it comes to the engagement of socially excluded groups. And I go, very good, it's taken 40 years. It's easy to be cynical, I don't want to be cynical about the situation, but we are not great at learners. And even when we do monitoring and evaluation, which is usually an integral part of our programs, that's usually about bookkeeping, not about learning. Most monitoring and evaluation programs that I've seen and that I've been involved with try to hide mistakes. Right? And as everyone knows, the best learning comes out of things that went wrong. As the saying goes, getting it wrong is part of getting it right. Yeah? Keep that in mind. And certainly as students, this is the only time you've got the opportunity to get it really wrong, rigorously, and still get an A. Yeah? So get it wrong. Try it out. Get off the safe ground. All right. That's all assumption one. Yikes. Do you want a couple of hours? Yeah. Assumption two, so assumption one was about the scope and nature of practice. Let's begin to redraw the boundaries. Let's begin to take agendas on board that were not in the past conventionally part of our process. Assumption two is about the life and organization of place, recognizing the intelligence and informality out there. You know, I was asked, just as I arrived here, what do you think of Mali? And I go, you know, people saying, oh, it's claustrophobic, I need to get out, all the rest of it. Yes, I'm not talking about somebody who lives here. But when I walk the streets of places like this and I see the incredible ways in which people are improvising, in the way that they use space, and the way that the flexibility works, and the way that certain materials are used in different ways, I think, my goodness, it's an unbelievably creative setting. I need that intelligence. Right? The intelligence and informality, which we find in the streets of Edinburgh. Let's find it, let's build on it, let's help it along rather than try and stamp it out in the context of you've got to fit the master plan. You know, the plan with the pink bits, red bits, and green bits. You play in the green, you live in the red, you do something else naughty in the blue bits, and the rest of it. Yeah? It's insidious. Right? So, assumption two is about the life and organization place, recognizing the intelligent formality. We need to recognize the need at least for two kinds of organization in any place we care to look at. Right? And importantly to coexist. And they tend to be in tension, if not in conflict. And the first is what's referred to as emergent organizations. And the second is designed organizations, planned ones. Let me just briefly give you a definition. Emergent organizations are small, self-organizing, creative, flexible. We see them everywhere. Informal organizations, youth clubs, community-based organizations, which come, respond to need, and go. And by the way, the whole concept of emergence was the basis on which the internet was designed. I'll just tell you a very little story. There's a book, in fact, called Emergence, some of you might like to look at. And it was a study that was being conducted at the time at MIT and at the Sloan Kettering Institute in New York by some biologists. And for some reason, they wanted to try and understand the behavior of cells in what they call slime mold. I don't know what it's like here, but slime mold in northern climates is this brown blobby stuff that sticks to apple trees. It's very common, right? And apparently it had a sort of intelligence that they were trying to grab. Yeah? And they studied it, and they looked at it, and they did an experiment. They made a maze. Everyone knows what a maze is. They put food at one end, a bit of slime mold at the other. They wanted to see if the slime mold could find the food. Sure enough, I don't know how many days, what the time scale was, this blob wound its way and gobbled up the food at the other end. And I thought, my goodness, we found something here. This blob must have a brain. Or if not a brain, a pace setter, a leader, a guy with a flag in the front going, you follow me and we'll find the food. So for years, they tried to understand the function of the mold based on the assumption that it had a brain or a pace setter, and they didn't find it. So they changed the assumption. They said, well, what if there is no leader, right? There is no brain, central brain, as in the planning office or whatever it is. What if, in the context of need, these cells begin to communicate with each other, and the I becomes a we, the individual becomes a collective, in the context of satisfying a collective need. And that is exactly what they found.